This video is an interview of Dr. Stephen Porges by Dr. David Berceli discussing the concepts of spirituality from a polyvagal perspective. The video is divided into 18 different subcategories around this topic. There is a lot of research that's being done on post-traumatic growth. One of the comments that's often made in post-traumatic growth is that the higher activation of the vagus nerve, the more likely the person is to report having experienced a spiritual experience. And so this question about spiritual experience is so difficult to put a handle on because science doesn't particularly like it, the medical field doesn't like it, certainly a lot of educational groups don't like this. So I want you to do is talk about whatever this thing is about spirituality, whatever we call it or however we want to frame it, and how does it work with the vagus nerve?
Okay, so I mean, these are great questions. I try to approach them in a chapter I wrote in the Handbook for Compassion Science. I call it Vagal Pathways, Portals for Compassion. But now let's clarify this. When we use the word or try to focus our whole discussion on a nerve, we have to reconceptualize really what we mean by that. The nerve is merely a cable, it's a conduit, it's a highway that's providing information going in two directions. And so the vagus nerve as itself doesn't carry with it executive functions, doesn't carry with it spirituality, it doesn't carry with it anything other than a bunch of signals going to the organs and the organs conveying those signals to the brain. And what we're really asking the question is to get into a state in which we can be both emotionally or spiritually expansive, whether we can be as it boldly go where we have never gone before or no one has gone before. We need to be in physiological states that enable us to feel safe. So boldness is really the other side of being safe. And we kind of mess this up in our thinking, in our society. We want people to perform, and performance is often very articulated as productivity, meaning amount that you can produce, number of papers, number of products, number of cars, number of dollars. It's very, we use words like it's linearly organized. But what we're trying to do is objectify a sense of success as a human being. Now, the part that we need to think about is our nervous system is not a simple machine. Simple machines, you put something in, you get something out. We're a creative machine, if we can call it a machine. We have emergent properties. We are a complex system. The problem with translating that both into a science world or an education world is people do not like to conceptualize complexity or systems that have within them feedback loops or self-learning systems, systems that can adjust, that can become more than what they start off as. So we want to think that we become the sum of our parts, when emergent properties can often be greater than. So when we move into the world of spirituality, if we move into the world of creativity, if we move into the world of dreams, we're talking about properties of a complex system. And now we have to ask questions, how do we get that system into the state that will enable those emergent properties to come out? So that's the whole pitch here. That's the story. And spirituality requires a certain state. Compassion requires a certain state that can be overlapping. The ability to connect, to love another human being is really based on premises of feeling safe and trusting others. But even when we move into the notion of spirituality, we're also in a sense of being trusting. I was in India in the early 1990s, and I stayed at the Ramakrishna Institute for Culture and Study or something of that order. And I learned about Ramakrishna. And he was basically like the Delphi Oracle. He was really dissociative. And so his ideas didn't go anywhere really at that time. He needed a spokesperson, a charming person. That was Vivekananda. And he brought the Indian philosophy to the U.S., and he was a charming person. People found it of interest. But when I was reading about him, I kept on saying to my wife, I said, I would like to be taken care of as well, in the sense that if we are going to be spiritual, we can't be vulnerable, because vulnerability requires a different physiological state. And if we want to, in a sense, move into this expressive, expansive world, our bodies need to be taken care of. They need to be saved. That means external cues of those that we can trust, but also means internal cues of physical health. And of course, ancient traditions acknowledge both of those. Our society doesn't.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now, when we were talking before, you had said something, I wrote it down here, something about stillness
Oh,
as
yeah.
somehow being part of this experience you're speaking about. Could you tell us some more about it?
So over the years, I've realized that stillness is viewed by people in different ways. So for some of us, we think of the word stillness as just where we want to be, because time expands and now we can move wherever we can be that creative person in a sense of stillness. But to many, and I would say lots and lots of people, stillness is vulnerability, especially if they have trauma histories. So a sense of stillness is so frightening to the people that they can't deal with it. If you talk about it, they start even mobilizing. And I'll push it to the extreme. The worst thing for a human, of course, is isolation. And isolation is a metaphor for functionally not being in your body. And when I would uh, try to explore this in workshops and with groups, I started to realize that there's one thing that people tend to be universally the most frightened about, and that is a locked out syndrome, in a sense, being consciously aware without motor control, or metaphorically being buried alive. And that the visceral response to that conceptualization frightens people. And that's where some people think stillness is. Stillness is not in that state. Stillness is in where you give up the anxiety, you give up the pressures of time, and now you are free to move around in time and in your memories. A little aside on this, my nephew has a son who's on spectrum, and I've developed an intervention which we call the Safe and Sound Protocol. And his son listened to it for a few minutes and said, time slowed up, and which is a child's, in a sense, reflection that anxiety went away. And stillness, for many people, is a conceptualization of no anxiety. But when people have this vulnerability, and often linked to trauma histories, immobilization without fear is not a possibility. So stillness becomes immobilization, which is a trigger to mobilize and get the hell out of there.
Wow. Well, in light of that, then, how do you describe people reporting having had spiritual experiences, either both in their trauma experience
Hmm.
or after they've resolved their trauma experience through post-traumatic growth? What's going on there? What are we calling spiritual? What sensation are they really having?
This is actually a marvelous question. It's like, what do we mean by love?
Mm.
Is it a love that makes us feel safe, or is it a passion in which we feel vulnerable? And I think spirituality pulls on both those dimensions. One is a dimension of connectedness, um, which is in a sense emboldening and allows us to explore. The other one is a sense of awe, in which we now feel like we're insignificant. I would like to play with some of the ideas that you just said. So let's say that I'm in a life threat situation, and now my body goes literally into almost a fainting spell. It becomes dorsal vagal, it goes vasovagal syncope. I start to pass out. I start getting less blood to the brain. What does my brain make of those reduced signals? This is, for some people, they see the white light. For some people, there's a whole set of issues of what our body and our emergent properties of this complex brain that we have, what we do with the information that we get, what is the narrative that we start to put together, and what is the narrative that enables us to feel better. So flipping right back to the narrative of my nephew's son, his narrative was that time slowed up. The narrative of losing consciousness may be, I'm giving up all my defenses. Now, the afferent of that is that of submission. And actually, there in certain religions, there's various words used that when one gives up the fight and just becomes accepting. So we know we have two ways of giving up giving up fighting. I wouldn't say that we're giving up our defenses, but giving up uh, actively fighting against something. One is through the pathways that I talk about, social engagement, which I view as that vagal pathway towards compassion. But we also have another vagal pathway that shuts us down, and that shutting down is also giving up fighting. And the question is, when we get into the latter, what do we do with the feedback, the afferent feedback that's affecting our brain? What is the narrative that we create that makes us feel comfortable with the experience?
Wow. You know, you mentioned the word awe. I wrote it down, a sense of awe. And I'm wondering, is that also a sensation of something like spirituality, a sense of awe or
I,
beyond
I, I,
ourselves?
I played with this in the chapter that I wrote on rituals and contemplative science or contemplative experiences. And I used as the metaphor the large Gothic cathedrals with these enormous organs. So you now have a fortress. And now what did the large organs, what was the music? It was low frequency sounds. But low frequency sounds, they're cues that are wired into our body as predator sound, earthquake, uh, something behind us. But now you're in this structure, this fortress, which does not have windows to see things walking by, but it has stained glass windows that are radiating other issues. So now we move that person into that immobilization with fear or submission. And now we bombard them with these low frequency sounds, but the narrative now is, I'm not going to be hurt. I just have a sense of awe and appreciation for this powerful deity.
Along with that has become the question often about the word humility and the
Hmm.
confusion between humility and humiliation. And
Yeah.
this is often around the issue of spirituality or religions in general. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think it's the same thing, is the difference between being in awe of and feeling small compared to a deity versus being humiliated or being immobilized with fear or immobilized now. The narrative is different. The narrative is, I feel small, I feel humble compared to the power of a deity or power of something, of an form of energy, or even a narrative. I feel that I'm nothing compared to the entire interaction of connectedness of humanity. I'm just nothing. But it doesn't mean I feel humiliated. It's like, can I immobilize without going into a state of immobilization with fear and disappearing?
Wow. Helping people understand these subtle, which seem subtle differences, is really helping people recognize their way out of their trauma behavior patterns.
I think what we're really talking about is how we build our narrative of our bodily feelings. And I think the metaphor which is useful is the church organs playing these low frequency sounds and where our body's vibrating. And now our narrative is shifted into awe and a collectiveness as opposed to an immobilization of fear and being humiliated. But think of the narrative as being so powerful. And so when we talk about the emergent properties of our nervous system, this wonderful complex system, which can now take bodily feelings and rearrange the narrative. And what is the treatment of trauma? It's about reinvestigating those bodily feelings and now restructuring the personal narrative. And often, I think you're absolutely right, it's not the pain of the trauma, It's now the reconceptualization of the narrative that brings people through their journey and makes them more complete and healthier.
When you're talking, it reminded me, Joe Dispenza just wrote a recent
Yeah.
book called Becoming Supernatural. And
Mm.
in the book, he talks about a transformation point. And he says, after that transformation point, which is a bit like what we're talking about in terms of
Mm.
rewriting the narrative, he said, after the transformation point, a person experiences life differently, sometimes completely differently, and that their new life that they're experiencing is more profound than their former life. Can you talk about what's happening in this transformation?
Well,
I mean,
okay, so life is all about transformation. At least that's for some of us, that's our goal in life. And I would almost say that the goal in life is to be a level of transformation that when we we transition out with a feeling of completion, not with frustration. So it's a strange set of goals that it's not that I want to accumulate more or have more impact, but I want to be happy. I want my narrative to be comfortable so that when I say goodbye with a smile. Okay, so this is where we really are trying to work with. And when we talk about these transformative moments, we're talking about people giving up something, giving up a need, let's say a need for an award, a need for a certain amount of money, a need for certain brand cars, a need for certain things that can be seen in the material world, because it means what we're really saying is it's not internalized within me, it's how others see me. And the transformative moments are we kind of give up those external ones and say it's all inside me. And when I'm finally comfortable with who I am, I smile and say goodbye. And okay, but the contradiction with that is we're all human. And part of our humanness is that we take responsibility for others. We're not only connected to others, but we take responsibilities. So when I said earlier that I wanted, after being in India, I told my wife I would love people to take care of me, and then I could just spend my time going on these journeys. That was, in a sense, a misunderstanding of where I was on my journey because I had young kids at that point. When you have young kids and you have a professional spouse whose career is important and the kids are important, you can't go that journey. That journey is just not there for you because if you go on it, you're going to be hurtful to those close to you. And we know there are examples of that where people just disappear because that's it. They're just something else. And so I stayed within the confines, but I never gave up the dream of the journey. And that kind of makes me kind of unusual within the academic world because those who had dreamed of these personal journeys quickly left academics because it's not the place for that. It's a place where the external world is doing all the defining, it's all evaluative. It's not a very Buddhist perspective on life. Everything, it's evaluation all the time by everyone around you, and everyone is kind of viewing you as a number, meaning a relative ranking of everyone else. Now, again, I will say I have been very fortunate because I understood that game and was sufficiently skilled to do well in that game. So I was never hurt by that. I just didn't think that was the right way of evaluating people.
true. I think this is probably what's underlying the problematic issue about inviting this topic of what we're calling spirituality, for lack of a better word, into the fields of science and academics.
Yeah, I think they want it to be localized in an area of the brain. They want things to be within their models. And so they want to create it in the way that they think they want to now put it into it. Now, what if the brain and the nervous system is very complex, which it is. And now with all the concepts of embodied psychotherapy, embodied philosophy, there's a respect of the power of the body in conveying sensory information to the brain and literally tilting or distorting our perspective of the world. And so no longer can we say it's all in your head. Many things are coming up from your body. And we need to also realize that what's going on in our head is projecting or promoting certain neural changes in our body. And as we talk to each other, we can see that there are a couple that are very obvious. The intonation of voice, the motor movement of our facial expression, my hand gestures, which I'm seeing popping up on the screen, that as we build reciprocity in a dyadic interaction, our nervous systems of both of us, ours, are trying to interact to stay on a theme in which we can now communicate something of interest to others.
When you talked about these, and you're talking about the brain, the nervous system, neural pathways, afferent to efferent communication between the brain and the body, how do we put something like this concept of intuition as a form of communication that goes on between human beings?
Okay, so that's where concepts in my work are become words like neuroception, where we have our bodies are picking up cues that we can't even articulate. We don't know what they are because we don't know truly what the receptors are or the patterns that we're looking for. And neuroception gets at part of it because it identifies some. It says facial expression, intonation of voice are powerful. They change our physiological state. And examples like, even if you're engaging me and I turn away, you get a massive biological response. And if you're a therapist, or let's say a client with a therapist, and the therapist lifts up the person's arm to look at the watch, there's a massive visceral reaction, which is a reaction of violation of trust and safety. So our bodies are always going through this. We just have very poor vocabulary. And part of it, and this is where I would bring you back, you've been asking about words that either have a history of philosophy or religion or psychology. And those words, we might do better talking about physiological states and then building upward and saying certain states are literally neural platform for a variety of psychological experiences. And those experiences then become a platform for a variety of psychological terms.
But the tremor mechanism that we activate in TRE, as I've been practicing it over the years with people, I can see that it is some sort of neural movement, some neurological, physiological sense that does change the state, the physiological and psycho-emotional state of the individual. Can you explain how you think or why you think this is?
Well, from the moment I saw you do that, I said, it's all about the narrative. The power is in the narrative. You're really triggering a physiological reaction. The power is in the narrative.
That was in Norway when you watched me. And you told me it was when they fell in love with you.
Right. Which is well, there's a lot to that. Yes, they did fall in love with you, but what was it? They trusted you and they felt that you had in part an answer, that you had who you are, which is this generous, trustworthy type of person. So you're not hurting them. And now they're going into a physiological state that may have certain associations, certain visceral associations with injury or being harmed. And now this magnanimous person is there with them and helping them structure a narrative. It's brilliant. And you can see it's brilliant because it's so efficient. And it's really saying, what does our body want to do in any form of trauma therapy? We want to revisit the visceral feeling, and we want to now have a top-down narrative that contains it, doesn't allow it to mobilize us, that we don't obsess with it. We have a different verbalization. We feel different about it. And that's what you do. I didn't mean to minimize it.
Not at
but
all.
sometimes simplicity, it's really the best complement of hitting a basic principle of how our body reacts. So you just get people there very quickly.
All right, let's look at the the polyvagal theory in very simple terms, a ventral vagal and a dorsal vagal experience. Are you saying that people can rewrite a narrative in either one of those nervous states?
Oh, yeah. And what I'm saying is that even when the dorsal vagus may have been triggered in defense, those visceral feelings can now be with a narrative. Once they get a narrative of safety, they're really bringing the ventral vagus in, which is a regulator of the dorsal vagus. So they're basically reconnecting their body. And so the narratives become powerful.
And so then you're suggesting that that dialogue between client and therapist, et cetera, is an essential component for helping the individual rewrite the narrative, activating a ventral vagal response.
Right. Now, I'm going to say it can be a structured, efficient way, but also will tell you there are other ways. And and I'm sure you've had people who deal with religious visualizations or memories of their parents when they were young in a very positive way, or loved ones, where they grab those memories, they're functionally iconic memories, almost in the Byzantine model. They take that memory and they use that memory to negate that visceral shutting down or the fear mobilization, because polyvagal theory tells you it's a hierarchy. If I can get the feeling of safety and trust, which I can get from a memory, I can now downregulate my mobilization, fight, flight, or my shutting down responses. And that's what other people will do.
Wow. You hear this a lot with soldiers, as an example,
Yeah.
where they come back from having been in war and they regain some sort of appreciation for their religious background. So they'll often go to church or synagogue where they weren't doing it before. And often many of them will do something like become Buddhist, as an example.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
I think it's about connectedness, because going to war has, well, I was actually listening to, I think it must have been the NPR or something a couple of days ago, where some people were saying they found the greatest love in battle, meaning they had the greatest trust for the people they were their comrades in battle. They had great trust in. So the word trust and love become intermixed. When they come back, people need an affiliation. They need part of that safety net. Religion or synagogues or churches or men's groups or women's groups become surrogates for that support system.
Wow. What I find around the world, since I work so much with trauma zones, but in trauma situations or natural disasters where people are forced to face potential life or death threat, this transformation occurs where they actually feel closer to the individual they survived with, even for a short moment, than they do with family that they have lived with for many years.
Okay, so the example I use to be totally consistent with what you're saying is I have a friend who worked with Navy SEALs. Okay. Now, one of the major points of being a Navy SEAL is the camaraderie, the building of this group. And how do they do that? Well, they basically are resuscitated. They drown and are resuscitated.
Right.
And that's an important transition, because it means they're going to give up the fear when they have those problems, because they know their comrade will be there to take care of them. Okay, that's a powerful physiological. I mean, so it's done in the training, and so now on a neurobiological level, they have now dampened this basic fear of shutting down, because the person knows they're going to be taken care of. Now, the bottom line on this metaphor or vignette is what the psychiatrist friend told me next. He said that these people will tell me or tell him that if their group is being shipped out, they'll be with them, just give them an hour to say goodbye to their family. Then they said, well, if my wife left me, well, that's another story. So the issue is the connectedness is with the people they've had those experiences with, not with their family. So what you find out is that with a lot of people in these special forces, there are issues of difficulties within the family. There's abuse, there's problems. But the linkage and the bonding between the comrades in arms is just there's a beautiful part of it, but from a training perspective, you can see how it was, these were manipulated. It was basically explaining how our bodies work and now using that in a proactive way, which made them in this group into a very uh, fearless fighting unit.
Right. Now, it's interesting, too. One of the biggest traumas for soldiers coming back when they leave the military, that whole system of safety and connection, it's just fractured in one day. They're out of the military and away from their colleagues and
Yeah.
comrades and lost.
There's another point that's lost, and the people that I know who have made careers in the military, one of the things that they like is that it's a meritocracy, and they understand that within the military. But when they then start going into business or industry or academics, they see it as more fluid and less predictable. So the predictability of the meritocracy is very useful in people feeling secure. And the metaphor I use, so if we think of about, I'm going to move the metaphor slightly and talk about what autistic individuals often do. They often try to organize things. If things are a different size, they line them up because the nervous system's expectancy is a metaphor for safety. If I know what's going to happen, if I know what is next in line, then my nervous system is calmer. And what happens when they leave the military, all the predictability is gone. And now their nervous system is just in states of chaos and danger.
That's a very interesting point. It's truly a nervous system reaction to a startled reality difference.
A reality with less predictability. So if we take the notion of predictability as having a benefit, in a sense, the metaphor is that if I know what's happening, I'm safe. If I don't know what's going to happen, I'm not safe.
Hmm.
And of course, with very safe and trusting people, they can be bolder and now deal with uncertainty. So you deal with this circularity that if I have a stable home, a good, strong relationship, I have a safe base, and now I can use that or leverage that to be exploratory, to be creative.
I'm going to shift a little bit from that to ask you, because out of curiosity, when we're talking about the vagus nerve, is there any direct relationship with the vagus nerve and the pineal gland, which is often promoted as some gland that's important in these experiences that we're talking about in terms of spiritual?
I know little about that, but remember, endocrine changes affect autonomic function. So in my world, the endocrine system, the immune system, and the autonomic system are all the same. They're all integrated parts of each other.
Mm.
So it's not discounting the possibility. It just hasn't played a central role in my thinking yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Can you tell me, in a summary form, what should the individual be aware of or conscious of when we're talking about them moving into this direction that we're calling spirituality, to give them sort of guidelines or, stepping
Oh,
points?
okay, so let's talk first about the down part, the downs, the down, the vulnerabilities tell you what you need to look after. So let's say with people with trauma histories, when they try to do meditation in groups, they often get into physiological states of fear, defensive, and panic because cues of safety now become cues of vulnerability.
Hmm.
So the real issue is we need to understand that people need to be safe and what are the cues. So Often, even doing meditation, if you have a wall behind you, it's helpful. Also, understanding the impact of, in a sense, triggering the vagus. If you exhale slowly and you now slow your heart rate, increase the vagal activity, and your body becomes calm, calmness to many people is a vulnerability to be attacked,
Mm.
especially if your associations are the last time, in a sense, let's put it metaphorically, your nervous system is saying the last time I felt safe, I was raped, or last time I was attacked, or I was broadsided in a car. So a lot of people have that. And once their body goes into safety, they're giving up defense, but their nervous system is telling them the world's not safe. You better get that defense back or you're going to be hurt. So we have to really appreciate what the nervous system is attempting to do. And now we have to re-educate the nervous system. That's what tree and other things are doing. They're re-educating by getting the same bodily feelings, but now changing the top-down narratives to contain those feelings. When you have that social engagement system, that ventral vagal system, the sympathetics are not dormant and the dorsal vagus isn't dormant. They're now doing what they're supposed to do. So in a way, the ventral vagus and the social engagement system they're facilitators of autonomic regulation. It's only when that social engagement system is turned off that the other two components are vulnerable to become defensive, and they follow a hierarchy, meaning that we will use our mobilization, but when we do that, we interfere with the vagal function of our gut. We turn it off. We become constipated. We're not perfusing well. And when that doesn't work, we can literally dissociate and shut down. So the hierarchy is very interesting because when you get the social engagement system as the boss, the other parts are brought into the play. They're integrated. And there's an interesting uh, bit of feedback. I developed this auditory intervention called the Safe and Sound Protocol, and someone used it on a dissociative identity disordered patient. But if we think about dissociative disorders as really people being locked in different polyvagal states, being locked into a more ventral social integrated versus a fight, flight, defensive one, where the person becomes often aggressive, or the victim, which is a dorsal vagal shut down submissive one. They use this intervention, which is an acoustic intervention that stimulates ventral vagal function. And what happened with the parts start to talk to each other and reintegrate it. But the part for me, which the reason, first of all, dissociative identity disorder can be very diffuse or diverse in how it's manifested. But in this case, it was really quite simple because the identities, the parts, were very much linked to different physiological states. So if you get the states more integrated, then the manifestation, the neural platform, the emergent properties are that of a more integrated personality. I think that the message that I have is very intuitive, that everyone, if I can articulate it, it becomes aha, of course. And so I feel that the burden is on me, that if I can get the language and create a sufficient number of examples where people have some feelings in their body to the examples, which may be pictures, then they understand. For me, the most confirming statement is when someone says, "I learned so much from your talks," and I say to them, "Come on, be honest. You didn't learn anything other than your intuitions were confirmed." And then you get the nod or the smile, and then you know that you've really, really made contact because you're reaching into the person's visceral experiences and you're giving them a different language to explain it. I went on my own personal journey because I had health issues. So it was, in a sense, a very disruptive period of time. And I started to understand more. I was working during this period on what I think is the vulnerable process of that what trauma hits, and that is purpose in life. So I think if trauma were an archer, it would hit purpose in life because it doesn't matter what you've done, nothing has any real uh, value or excitement at that point when your body's in those states. And many people who experience trauma have those experiences. Now, for me, I had those experiences. Now, all I can say is there's two parts of me. There's, of course, the person who experiences things, and then there's part of me that observes the person who's experiencing things.
Right.
And this has been how I have lived my life. So part of me was in hell. The other part was saying, what can I learn about this? So it was very interesting experience. And as I learned about this, how can I use this to relate to other people and to respect their feelings without saying, I know how you felt? Because telling people that you know how they feel is basically, I don't understand why it works this way. When you make those types of statements, and if someone made those to me, you know they're not truly witnessing. So I started to learn, and again, this goes back probably to your early theological training, the power of witnessing. Witnessing is something that we don't do right. We try to fix without respecting the person's experience. So I started to get a better sense of what it was to be a compassionate listener. And I think this is really, if anything is transformative in my life, it's that understanding that you don't fix things. You listen and witness and support. I think that's what the trauma, let's say the survivors of trauma, what that community really wants. It wants the respect of being listened to. Uh, what it does, it gives you a sense of gratitude of being able to be in that place, and also gratitude for having experienced some of these darker moments. And also, I would say a degree of compassion for those who had to share those moments with me, which means my family, that I had, have to have an understanding of what my cues, my behavior, what that was doing to them, because they couldn't fix it. And what you're now doing is your presence is being hurtful to others. And I think this is the message that many survivors of trauma have learned. That's why they don't talk about it, because if they talk about it, they trigger hurt in others, and they trigger aggression and a need to fix. And that's not what they want. They just want to be heard. They want to be witnessed. They want to be supported. So my disruption, my pain, whether it was emotional or physical, or made them feel uncomfortable. And that was far from what I wanted to do. So it's this paradox. I wanted to be witnessed and comforted, but my presence now was disruptive to others. And I realized that functionally, they didn't understand, nor could they understand, because they were not in a physiological state that would enable them to relate. And that's a tough place, because you need support. And we just, our culture doesn't really provide people with the right guidelines. We are such a pragmatic culture that says, you have, quote, you have everything to live for, you should enjoy this, you should do that. Well, if you're not feeling like you have anything to live for, you're not enjoying anything, someone telling you to do it is just disrespectful. And that's what our body is saying. It's a biological rudeness to us, and you're not any help to me. And I don't want to hurt you, but you're not any help. So we really just don't understand what it is to be a human. So part of my mission or my journey is what I used to say, polyvagal theory is the unwritten manual of being a human being. And meaning unwritten, it's still being written or incomplete. We're learning more. We learn, neuroception tells us a lot. Biological rudeness explains our society a lot. Our perceptual biases, which tend to be more negative when we're defensive, all these things explain a lot of our interactions with each other. And now the comorbidities of all these gut problems makes sense based upon polyvagal theory. And polyvagal theory also provides us with portals of treatment, whether it's through breath and improving autonomic regulation, or intonation of our voice, where our nervous system says, oh, that's just like a mother's lullaby. I can now drop defenses. Oh, it's about 2001. I wrote a short book called Conversations with Shiva. Did I tell you this story at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, it's it's a little book. It's called Conversations with Shiva, a Biotheology. It's really based on the premise that what if our theological perspective was consistent with our body? How would life be?
Wow.
And it's based upon my travels to India in 1992, Calcutta. I spent a month in Calcutta and then went up to Darjeeling in the mountains. And it's my travel log, but also what I did in 2001. I wrote a myth. I wrote a myth of, basically, it's a myth of polyvagal theory in myth form, and it's basically talking about the garden and saying that you may have heard the myth of the garden. This is to you, the Garden of Eden, but they got it wrong. That the Garden Eden, the garden story is really a story of evolution, and you start off as sit and wait feeders like other reptiles, without any ambition, without any longevity, without any, I should say, mortality, without any offspring. And then you get wisdom, you grow. It's a story of evolution, and the important part is the leaving of the garden. And so I tell this as a story, and about how it provides you really with an understanding of the evolution of the autonomic nervous system and the faces that we can project with that. And so that becomes that myth. So I wrote that.
I believe there are many people so desirous of this type of depth of dialogue and exploration of their own humanness. It's
Yeah.
a deep desire in humanity, and it's not being satisfied in the way that you're just talking about. And that's painful in some regard for me.
It's very painful because there's this inconsistency between, if we go full circle and you start with the questions of spirituality, and that people have treated spirituality as if it were not neurobiological, or if they treat it neurobiological, they thought they could find it through imaging. And they're missing all the major points. The spirituality and the neurobiology are all about being a complete human being. And it's supporting our physiology and supporting our connectedness with others and with the earth or with our environment. And that's what I tried to write about in myth form. And then the book takes it in myth, and then it takes the deconstruction of the myth in terms of the excitement of translating that. And that became the polyvagal theory. Now, the cute part of it, and I'll say there's a cute part. So I was back at the University of Maryland then, and I gave the manuscript to my research associate who had worked with me for 10 years. So she was very, and she reads this and she comes back and she says, now I know where you got your ideas on polyvagal theory. She actually believed that the story was true, that it was a deconstruction of an ancient Sanskrit manuscript.
Wow.
And when I was writing it, Sue and I were guests of the Rockefeller Foundation retreat in Bellagio, Italy. And there was a lot of people working on things, and we would leave our chapters when we were writing on a common table, and people could read them. And a person from India was there, and he read it, and he comes up to me and he says, first thing I said was, I hope you didn't mind how I described Calcutta. He said, nah, everyone knows that. And he says, but why did they give you that manuscript? I said, I made it up. He says, no, you didn't make it up. There are a lot of these Shiva manuscripts floating around. Why did they give it to you? As if they should have given it to him. And of course, I made it up. It's basically, it's about, in this manuscript, Shiva is really a person who comes from a more sophisticated society, and is actually aging out. He's dying, and the people want the gift of knowledge from him, and he's very concerned about giving insights to people. He doesn't know what they're going to do with it, which is a real interesting issue. And someone with great benevolence asked some of the questions, and he felt very good. Then he went on and told the story.
Wow.
But the issue is, we live in a world where insights can move into exploitation, and exploitation can move into being empowering those to harm others. We have to be very careful about that.
Somehow, for me, traumatized people, when they're seeking desperately that pathway towards recovery, that's when they can start looking outside the box.
Yeah.
And that's where they start looking for these types of writings and reflections, because somehow they're more open to them in that journey than they are in their regular journeys of life.
Well,
I really just appreciate, just personally, having had this dialogue. It was really good for me.
well, we'll have others because you sit in the world with this shared vision that there is a part of us that is a spiritual part,
Mm,
and there's a part of us that takes information from that realm and tries to help people in a very physical context.
mm,
And I do too. And
yes,
so
yes.